Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk. The Mackenzie Institute has come to a very special place, Regina, middle of the country, east-west, not north-south of course, there's a lot more Canada north of here. And this is one of the world's largest urban parks, Wascana Park, surrounded by what was originally called the Wascana Centre Authority. In it is the legislature, of course, behind me. There was once a hospital, there's the university, and other public purpose buildings and uses. The interesting thing is, this was set aside 100 years ago or so. This was built, this constructed lake, as a depression project. Fabulous to think that people had the foresight to create this wonderful urban resource that contributes to people's mental and physical well-being. Well, there's more to Saskatchewan than this wonderful park. There's interesting public policy, there are security issues, and there's the Johnson-Shoyama School of Public Policy. That's why we're here. First thing we're going to do is talk public policy. The newly refurbished College Avenue campus at the University of Regina has a long and distinguished history. It's in keeping with Saskatchewan's core value of education. The other interesting thing about the building is that it houses the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. Now, why Saskatchewan has a long, interesting, and creative history of public policy is a whole other discussion, but let's start with these two people. Thomas Shoyama was from British Columbia, Al Johnson from Saskatchewan. They ended up working here on Medicare. Al Johnson later worked in Ottawa, and I met him when he was head of the CBC. But I'm here to talk to Justin Longo about digital and about social media and new media. Are these things going to keep us safer? Are they going to make accountability in government better? Are we really in a digital revolution? That's what I'm here for. Part of the issue of security is citizens feeling they have delegated their authority to their governments. The governments are acting in accordance with their general wishes. And the governments are continuing to reassert their legitimacy. You've questioned about how important all this is. Talk about that for a bit, if you will.
Yeah, I think governments need to be reminded how important it is to have citizens continually engaged in their democracy, and not just by virtue of the occasional trip to the ballot box in a voting, in an election, but rather to have them continually part of building the democracy and building the society. Without that active involvement continually, governments can pass laws, and they do have the ability to enforce those laws, but what really makes a democracy work is to having people understand and believe that the laws are legitimate and that they're in the best interest of the country. And then people will contribute to that democracy through their active participation, not just by following the law, but by understanding what the reason for that law is and being part of making that democracy and that society work.
Well, based on the criteria you've mentioned, you could really say, well, it's not working at all. When you look at these polls that are taken about how little Canadians know about their laws or their history or the cabinet ministers' names, things like that, 14% of Canadians think Elvis is still alive. As Churchill said, best case against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the voters. So we're not doing all that well based on your criteria, are we?
No, and I will defend the position we're at right now by saying that we're at a pretty primitive stage of using this new technology to build a really robust democracy. I don't have illusions that we can recreate the Athenian democracy of active citizen participation in the public square. What I think we can do is we can start to replicate some of that using new technology to build an active citizenry, an active participation in continual politics. For too long, we've turned over to professional politicians and professional administrators the business of government and taken ourselves out of it. And it's now become a nice, comfortable position to be in, to say, well, that's somebody else's job. I can complain about it occasionally and maybe vote once in a while, but I don't have to be actively participating in it. I think it's actually to build that robust democracy in the future is going to require this active participation continually. And I think we've got within our reach the use of technology to make that happen. And what we see today, as I say, is pretty primitive. So we're using things like social media to replicate citizen engagement or citizen participation. But it's not an accurate replication of that Athenian democracy.
Well, I'm glad you're saying we're in early days and so on, because the contribution rate is low as a percentage of Canadians who wish to use social media to contribute to something. Up to 20% of Canadians are not hooked up to the internet. Many of the comments are less than helpful, and the government has no means of collating them and really using them, even if they were helpful.
Right.
So what causes you to be optimistic other than we have some new technology on the block that might work someday?
Right. So that criticism is valid. So you're right, about 80 to 90% of Canadians are connected to the internet, so 10% aren't. Of that 80%, 20% are connected on something like Twitter. Of that 20%, another 20% are the real active ones. So if we're looking at Twitter as a representation of Canadian values, we're getting 20% of 20% of 80%. And we should be careful about what we read into that. You know, the former minister for Democratic Institutions made the mistake of saying that we can count hashtags on Twitter that are an indication of citizen engagement with something like electoral reform. And that was legitimate, or rightly criticized as being an illusion. But at the same time, we start to have some of these mechanisms that can bring people into conversations without having to require them to physically be in the room. That was always the limiting factor in previous rounds of consultation. You had to go to the town meeting, you had to go to Ottawa to have your voice heard. And now voices can be heard quite easily. The challenge is, because so many voices can be heard, how do we pick out the information, the valuable information from that cacophony of voices?
Just one more criticism of the content of social media, and that is that somewhere in this university there's a first-year sociology professor reminding students of the history of polling, that if you poll people with telephones, you find out what people with telephones think. And if you poll people with magazine subscriptions, you find out what people who subscribe to that particular magazine think, hence Dewey wins, the famous error in polling. So we do, surveying people who only deal with social media is a methodological error,
yes.
Right?
Yeah, it certainly is. It gets even worse than that. So the work I do extends, what I'm trying to do is use this new technology to have more what I call passive participation rather than active participation. Getting on Twitter and telling your politician what you think is what I would call active participation. By virtue of you walking around in society with your cell phone is what I call passive participation. The patterns of behavior that you exhibit, the things you value through either your consumption or through your activities can be picked up in what is called big data. So that's a very, what I call passive, but I think powerful way of understanding people's values and society's values. Now here's the dilemma with that, is that people in my field will say, well, now we can see everything. I know everything that people are doing, and I have a sense of what society values. I can look at transportation patterns, consumption patterns. I can see how people interact in society. The problem is, who am I not seeing? And what the term we use is digitally invisible. Who's invisible in this robust new digital web of big data? Who's not showing up because they don't have the right technology? So that's an extension of the argument that says a big percentage of people aren't on Twitter. I'm extending that to say, just because we think we have these new sources of big data, don't forget who we're missing, who's invisible to our view because they're not carrying the right devices.
No smartphone, or just doesn't carry
internet
it, or what have you.
connection, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's an important point, because in politics, talk is cheap. People say they want something, do something, support someone,
Yep.
but if they actually take some action or donate some money, that's a different category of person. So big data can tell us that you actually do use the civic amenities on the waterfront, and you do want them refurbished and funded, as opposed to you just have a psychic benefit of
Yes.
wanting them there. But let me challenge something else. You said, well, people can participate more easily. They used to have to go to Ottawa, so on and so forth. Our democracy is flawed, but it is a democracy, and it does function. We have the Canada Gazette, which probably single-digit percentages of Canadians have ever heard of or read, but it is an effort to communicate with Canadians and is available. We have, in CRTC hearings, traditionally been required to deposit the application in libraries all over the coverage area and make all best efforts to reach out to the people who might be affected, not require them to go anywhere. We have 3 Supreme Court rulings on the duty to consult, indicating that there is a pretty well-defined requirement to create not only a pathway but a receptivity to consultations. We have question period, we have estimates committee, we have the public gallery, we have the press gallery. It's as if some researchers today think that democracy doesn't work, and now that we have digital tools in our pockets or smartphones, oh boy, now we're going to have it. What's wrong with all that other stuff we have?
Right, and those systems have been around for a long time and certainly did work, and they do allow access to people, they allow access for people to those conversations if they choose to exercise that. And I don't want to be an apologist for people who choose to not participate in the system. What I'm trying to find is easier ways for people to do that, ways that fit with their lifestyle, with the other things that they have to do. So people have a lot of things they have to do, they're very busy, and they find it difficult to engage with their democracy. Why do we have such low voter turnout? It's not because people don't feel like going down to the ballot box. I think the primary reason we have low voter turnout is people don't know who to vote for because they don't know what they're voting for. Now, you and I can parse through those issues. We have an idea of how to sift through information and come up with our preferred choice in an election, for example. But for a lot of people, it's simply something that doesn't register with them. It's not part of their daily activity. And they are not unconcerned, they just don't know how to express that concern. Now, what I find powerful about this mechanism, which says your digital signals tell us what you value by your actions, is that you don't need to make a second effort to then translate those actions into an expression of your values.
But you're going to end up being in another dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to jump from one fire into the frying pan. Voters in this part of the prairies think nothing of voting NDP one election and Alliance the next just to give it a try, and it's not an ideological choice as much as it's a protest against Eastern power interests, as SM Lipset talked about. You can say to those voters, you are irrational. You have made a ridiculous choice, but they've made the one that they're entitled to make in the democracy. When you're following people around with using big data, it's kind of a sneaky way to implement democracy. And you have to atone for being so sneaky in your public administration and using data in a way that no one told you to or asked you to. And secondly, you're still going to be in the dilemma of the psychic benefit. People are going to say, I want those amenities in this city. The power of Rough Rider fans in Regina, and yet maybe big data says they don't really, there aren't enough. So you're going to have the voters say they want something, doing something else, and who are you to pick which one's the one to follow?
Right. By tracking what people do rather than what they say they want, we do run in this dilemma of being locked into patterns, sort of path dependency patterns. So we're stuck with what we have because that's how people behave. If I went out and asked people in the city of Regina, would you like a new rapid transit system crisscrossing the city? A number of people would say yes, because it's a zero-cost thing to say yes at this point, and it's a sort of a hypothetical issue in the future. We have no idea if that means that they would actually take that rapid transit if it was made available to them, if we spent millions and millions of dollars to build it. So if I ask them what they do now, I can see people driving all over the city. There's very little public transportation here, so the reflection in behavior would be, well, we don't need a public transportation system because no one uses it, right? So we're stuck in that path dependency by looking at people what they currently do versus what they say they want. The problem with what they say they want is we can't be sure that they'll act on those values in the future, that they say, oh, I would love a rapid transit system, we build it, and then no one uses it.
Now, do you envision big data, i.e. machines, analyzing this information, or do you imagine a new army of civil servants analyzing, collating, and taking action and writing policy papers based on social media?
Yeah, as an instructor of future public servants and policy analysts, I had to be quite worried about their future prospects in the coming age of artificial intelligence, because in some ways I could envision a future in which a minister doesn't need policy analysts anymore. They simply ask some kind of natural language artificial intelligence system for essentially a briefing on an issue and get an answer, an intelligible answer back. Because in some respects, something like Google is at this moment an early stage artificial intelligence agent. I ask it a question, it gives me a bunch of answers. Now I need to sift through that information, but nonetheless, it's the start of what could be. I don't think, though, after having thought about this for a while, I don't think that we're moving towards a system in which we're going to get rid of the human policy analysts in government for a number of reasons. But it really comes down to the fundamental trust that gets built between a politician and their advisors in that analysis process. The thing the analyst does will certainly be affected by and will be amplified by coming artificial intelligence.
Well, you need a person to ask the right question of the artificial intelligence, because if you're searching liberation movements, if you don't know there's such a term as suffragettes or students for a democratic society, or other terminology that's been used, you might only get a couple of decades of the history of that. You rightly point out in your research that Keith Spicer, who ran a national public consultation program in the age of steam, it seems, no social media and what have you, reached far more people than some modern efforts using this technology.
Exactly.
Now, is that like saying, if somebody doesn't read the Canada Gazette, you can change the font, change the color, deliver it to everyone's home every day, and they're still not going to read it. So if people don't want to participate, they won't, even if there's social media.
Right. I mean, the Spicer Commission was the last great consultation effort in this country, wasn't it? It was a remarkable thing to see that happen. I was quite young when it did, but I do remember people sitting around their kitchen tables with their neighbors, filling out the booklets by hand. I remember, I've heard stories of them coming into Ottawa, these booklets, and people typing them up for the notes for the commission. We don't have that capacity anymore, and we're not going to do it. Though we try. You know, with electoral reform, we tried that. The minister distributed, at least distributed via the internet, workbooks for people to do that, and it became a laughing point. It was like, really, you're going to sit around with your neighbors and talk about electoral reform? So society's changed, and trying to use technology to replicate the past isn't going to get us there. We could undertake a massive effort like Spicer again on some issue of national importance. I'm not sure that people would show up. They would still engage with the process, but in ways that make sense for them. I'm of two minds of this issue of there's less time today. I understand people, this is sort of a pro forma kind of, this is how people see the world. There's just so less time, there's so much more to do, things move much faster. There's no less time today than there was 50 years ago. It's the same amount of time in a day. We just have this overriding perception, and this norm has crept in that there's less time today. So we need mechanisms to make life easier. When I look at digital government, most of the stuff I see in digital government, it's to make people's lives easier. You can fill out your taxes online, right? You can get a passport application online. This isn't a radical difference from the past. It's not magical. There aren't flying cars yet. But most digital government is about making life easier. Well, so in response to this idea that there's less time, I don't believe it, but I understand that that's the way people feel.
Well, I agree with you with time. There are apparently still 24 hours in a day and 60 seconds in a minute. But I'm not sure life is always easier with so-called new public management, which is driving everybody to the web. When you call the passport office, you get someone who doesn't know a great deal about how to get a passport. They are driving you back onto the web, even if you called them because you weren't satisfied with what was happening on the web. Ringing incessantly, nobody's answering the phone, and sometimes it isn't intuitively clear. The navigation of these government websites are different. We haven't really codified what is the most user-friendly way of interacting with the government.
Yeah, and it's true that one example is providing accessible services for people like with visual impairment on the web. So the government did get in trouble about 10 years ago for not providing accessible services on the internet, and was directed by the Federal Court of Canada to improve its websites. It did go through a massive effort to try to codify accessibility and to standardize the look and feel of most government websites. So they are learning as they go, and that was, we have to compliment them for that big effort that was, driven by a court case, but nonetheless did respond to this idea that just because you have a website doesn't mean you've covered all your bases. But it has allowed them to to feel like they can relieve some pressure from the actual storefront services or the in-person services. So to the extent that you can't, what am I trying to say here? You can't offer things online and then claim that you've covered the universe.
It's like saying go to the library and find it sometimes, which was a true statement 50 years ago, but impossible for many people if you didn't know the Dewey Decimal System and so on. Now, how about social media in a crisis? Have you looked at that? Because governments have them, private industry has them, and then governments have to step in. Where's all this communication fit in during a crisis?
Well, one of the things that has become difficult for governments to get their minds around is the fact that you're opening up the universe of people who have the ability to say something, and that increases the risk that someone will say something wrong. When there are limited numbers of channels of external communication from a government, it's easier to control the messages that are said and who says what. So when social media became a thing and people started to have independent accounts, like for example on Twitter, there had to be rules written to say to what extent are you an individual or are you actually an employee of the government, and how are you representing yourself on social media. When you're representing yourself as an employee of the government, what can you say, and what are the protocols for saying it? So then it became this ridiculous situation where there were 20 layers of approval to write a tweet. But that sort of reflexive risk aversion in the public service led to that position. Really interesting case in Saskatchewan a couple years ago, which illustrates the dilemma we're all facing on this distinction between individual and professional. It was a nurse certified under the Saskatchewan Registered Nurses Association who made a comment on Facebook about the performance of some nursing staff in a hospital that her grandfather was a resident in. And the mistake she made as far as the Saskatchewan Registered Nurses Association was that she made the comment publicly without directing it to the hospital directly, and secondly, made the statement on her social media account that she was a registered nurse. So it gave it that imprimatur of authority by saying that she had knowledge, experience and professional knowledge to judge this situation. After a long series of appeals and court cases, was found to be in contravention of her professional duties as a nurse. The alternative to that was, why do we not want professionals to be making observations about situations that they have experience and knowledge about?
Or limiting free speech or expression or rights because of membership in a professional body.
Right, and the real dilemma for this case was that there was, in another case, I'm losing the term. I'm going to say another registered nurse who stood outside of a clinic with a placard every day in his time off, complaining about a particular situation, and was not reprimanded. And the difference became, in my mind, it was because it was social media. So it was this new thing we didn't know how to handle. So somehow saying something on social media in a relatively mild way was a wrong thing to do. Standing outside a clinic with a placard and yelling at people was okay.
Interesting. Two real challenges if your democratic vision, continues to arrive apace from the future. One, we do have to have privacy because governments are now stripping some sensitive data out of the big data mine and selling it to pharmaceutical companies or others who might have an interest in demographic matters or psychographic matters, age, what have you. So how are you going to deal with privacy in this new era? Because if the government is enticing people to get on social media, Facebook and Twitter and what have you, and express themselves and so on, you can easily see stalking and safety concerns arising as a result, and it will be the government who enticed people into it.
Yeah, no, that certainly becomes more and more critical, and the challenge in big data is you can strip out personal identifiers in a data set, and say, oh, we're just turning out, this is interesting data for public policy purposes. The ability to what's called de-anonymize or re-identify people who have been anonymized in a data set is a real problem. And there's much smarter people than me working on how to solve that problem, but it is something governments need to be crucially aware of. There's a great initiative going on at StatsCan right now called its Modernization Project. It was given $41 million in the recent budget to update the way it collects data from Canadians and from businesses, and to do its business of national statistics. So it's moving to this method of collecting automated data from people, whether by their mobile phones, by their purchases, essentially buying data from those private holders to inform its approach to national statistics. But I mean, I have a great deal of trust in StatsCan's ability to understand the line between aggregate statistics and the point at which something is such low numbers that you can re-identify somebody in a small number set.
But down at the municipal level, where the consultation is going to be on, do you want red swings or blue swings, or any swings in that children's park, they don't have the sophistication that StatsCan does, or the budgets. They've enticed people in, and mothers and children and vulnerable people may have their identities exposed. So I think we have to think through that next step, if you agree.
I do, but at the same time, I think we're relearning, again through this technology, we're relearning the old history of the public square. The requirement that being a citizen in a democracy means being engaged in it, being part of it. I think we're at a transition point where we develop these anonymous societies by virtue of their size. We could be anonymous because we could live in a crowded city, but nonetheless still retain our anonymity. Trying to move backwards into the Greek agora, the Greek polis, requires us to re-embrace that idea of citizenship as being actively a part of it.
And your active citizenship, unlike in previous eras, is going to be photographed, video recorded, audio recorded, stored somewhere, and there will be a never-ending record of your participation in that little public square, which was not the original manifestation of democracy. No. You got in, you said your piece, people forgot, not everybody, and not everybody all over the world instantaneously knew what you were doing.
True, yeah, definitely is it's a magnified world in that respect. Geez, I just lost
and then finally, there's this great old-fashioned phrase from Washington when the politician receives the lobbying from the citizenry and constituents. Is this a grassroots action, or is it astroturf? Because you could manufacture by buying magazine subscription lists and writing letters and so on. You could whip people into a frenzy and cause them to write their congressmen and women.
Yes.
Today, some significant percentage of social media interaction is automated bots and fake and astroturf, or electronic turf, or whatever we should call it in this era. How do we fix that?
Right. I mean, there are good researchers who are able to identify those bots on Twitter. So we've gotten, as much as there was a rapid rise in that activity, there was a very quick response to say we're now able to identify those pretty easily. But I have to tell you, one of the things that does frighten me about the future is this increasingly blurry line between fact and opinion. Remember, Senator Patrick Moynihan used to say,
"You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts."
Exactly, and that was a great line, and it worked back then. And somehow that's just disappeared. It's whatever fact you can find, or imagine, or even just state with authority and conviction becomes the foundation for your argument. That does frighten me about the future, because I don't want to be in a position of saying, well, I'm going to judge that that's a fact and that's not a fact. I do want society to be in a position of being able to do that, and I'm not sure how we build those skills. We need to.
And it's not always just a misunderstanding. There can be a preponderance of evidence that these are the facts, and for an ideology may trump that. And the statement, "those aren't the facts," or "I don't believe those facts," is a surrogate for I'm unhappy with them,
Yes.
or I believe something else.
Right. Yeah, and that can be a dilemma for, again, the people we train in this school for being a policy analyst is, are you facing a minister who wants the answer that they're looking for? Or is your job to bring the answer as it's best grounded in your perspective? Again...
Unless ministers have changed a lot, I think I know the answer to that question.
Yeah. So it's, and even then, each policy analyst has their own view of the world. So what is a fact, even though that they're being trained in the idea of dispassionate and objective public service, they're seeing the world as a particular way, despite their best efforts to see it objectively. So it's quite a dilemma, and it becomes, I don't see it getting better before it gets worse. The ability now to produce a fake video, that someone can take an original video and using artificial intelligence manipulate the movement of the mouth.
We can spoof voices. We're pretty close to spoofing fingerprints, palm prints, retinal scans, and facial scans. I mean, we're going to be back to cops wearing out shoe leather and looking through the manual book of suspect pictures, I think.
Right. And again, back to Senator Moynihan, if you can't have the conversation based on the facts, you can't start to have the conversation. So that to me is a real dilemma for democracy going forward.
So you're used to correcting and educating people who are having conversations like this with you. If I forgot to ask any questions, omitted any important topics that you want to discuss, we've got a couple of minutes for you to rectify that.
Yeah, I think to me one of the most interesting things, and this goes back to the idea of how does government maintain its legitimacy in these broader conversations, is this phenomenon of what's called the economics of attention. Is that in the old days when there were 3 television stations can rule the conversation because you only had a very small number of places to go for your information. And when I was a kid, a television station could put anything on the air and I would watch it. I don't know how many reruns of Gilligan's Island I watched as a kid because that was the only thing that was available for me at that time. And so the reason that the economics of attention existed that way was because it was very expensive to have a television station, expensive to have a newspaper and a radio station. You needed the license and the equipment and the people to produce the content. That's completely inverted in this modern era. Anybody, any kid with a video camera can be a television station, right? They can make a couple of videos and put them on YouTube, and they have a television station. Their dilemma is they only have 3 viewers, because getting attention is the hard part. That's the expensive part. In the old days, sending the content out was the expensive part. The attention was cheap. So now that that's inverted, everybody has to compete for this attention. Facebook's entire business model is about capturing attention. It has to get people to come back to its site, and that's what keeps it up at night, is that worry. Governments have the same dilemma. They are no longer in a position of simply being able to publish the Gazette. They're no longer in a position of being able to say, we're holding a forum and having people show up, partly because of this idea that people are really busy, but partly because they have so many other choices that they have that they can go to.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.